Hello, everybody, and welcome to Positive Fandom. I'm your host, Artem, and today we have with us Darth Plato. How are you this morning, Darth Plato?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. Good morning, all.
Yes, and good morning to everybody in the chat. Today we have a fantastic discussion. We're going to be talking about one of the greatest love stories of all time, right here on Positive Fandom, Napoleon and Josephine, a love story, part one. And we'll be right back. I'm just going to play my promo now. Well, hello, everybody. We are back. I do want to say good morning to Tom Jr. Jackson, my moderator, my collaborator. We are all goof people. Tom Jr. Jackson, thank you for being here as always. And also, too, we have Star Wars community. Good morning, Star Wars community. It's so great to see you here this morning. And of course, we have Darth Plato with us now. Darth Plato, you and I have been talking about so much history over the last year or so. And it is not a surprise that today we are going to be talking about one of the greatest love stories of all time. And of course, we're talking about the love story between two historical figures, very well documented, Darth Plato, historical figures, maybe perhaps the most well documented historical figures of all time. That's Napoleon and Josephine. Certainly a story of the ages, Darth Plato. And, you know, you're the one who mentioned to me, and of course, we both know that there is a Napoleon, program coming up this year. And there's a lot of excitement and anticipation about this program, Darth Plato. But I was so excited when you told me about this made for TV movie from the 80s that stars Armand Assante and Jacqueline Bisset as Napoleon and Josephine. Yes. Darth Plato, how did you hear about this series and when did you first see it?
Well, I saw it when it first appeared on TV way back in the day. It was on the cover of TV Guide back in the day in the late 80s. And it was a TV movie. It was shown over multiple nights. I don't recall when. I think it was like 1988, I think it was, somewhere in there. And it was. I knew who Napoleon was at that time. I first saw the character in Time Bandits, but that movie doesn't really give him justice.
Yeah.
This is a much better presentation of him. At the same time, however, be aware that this is a story that is being shoehorned into a great, long, lengthy time, being shoehorned into a very narrow time on TV.
Certainly it is Darth Plato. And of course, the 80s, I guess maybe the 70s and the 80s were the eras of these fantastic and elaborate made for TV movies and epics like this one. Certainly, looking at this production wise, Darth Plato, and I don't know how many pictures they have on the IMDb page, although at that time they might not have had anything because people weren't pulling photos from IMDb in 1987, I imagine. But certainly, it is something to think about because at that time in the 80s, it was a big deal. If you got, if you were cast in one of these made-for-TV movies, it was a huge thing to be in, and it pretty much meant that everybody who had a television, and it was pretty much everybody in the U.S. at least, would be watching your show. This was the one you were going to watch. It was a big deal. So, I think it's very interesting that they chose to focus on Napoleon and Josephine here. And here, as I said, it stars Armand Assante and Jacqueline Bisset. Armand Assante obviously plays Napoleon. Jacqueline Bisset plays Josephine. And something, Darth Plato, what's so interesting about this, and it is true that Napoleon is known for being one of the most masterful military geniuses of all time. It's true. It's true. He's
Yeah.
known for that. He's known for his military abilities, what he's able to do on the field. I can't remember all the details, but a very good friend of my best friend, has been telling me about great military leaders and what their styles were. And he himself, my best friend, was in the military, and he would talk about how you would study these different things. But Darth Plato, this focuses on the love story, between these two historical figures. I mean, goodness gracious. What do you know about how this production came about? Do you know anything about it?
The production. Well, I don't know anything about the production itself. I know that the story focuses on the two of them and their relationship. So it's not a series about Napoleon. It's a series about the both of them together and their story and how they met and their tribulations and what ultimately became of that. They don't really get into the politics and the war itself. It does show some of the war that he's involved in, but it's really more of an afterthought than it is. That's more like snapshots than it is anything else. It doesn't really get into that.
Yeah, something. This is very true. I'm nearly finished watching. We're talking about part one of a three-part series that we're on Napoleon and Josephine, a love story. And you're right, Darth Leto. This mainly focuses on their love story, and there were a lot of made-for-TV movies and let's say miniseries. This could possibly be called a miniseries. I don't know if that's how it was put forward in the 80s, but there were a lot of these miniseries that focused on love stories during this period of time in television. Is that not correct, Darth Plato?
Oh yes, there were definitely all kinds of stuff on TV in those days, historical and not fictional. There was the V series was very well known. That's not historical, but it was a very well known TV series. There was the Shaka Zulu series that was more of a historical thing that came out earlier than Napoleon. Much more. That was a larger production, I think.
Yes, well, I was thinking as well as something like The Thornbirds, which
Okay.
was, a very kind of passionate, love-driven story. However taboo and scandalous it was a very high-rated, miniseries focusing on love stories that were incredibly popular in this time period. And it seemed like every so often there would be this love story or a miniseries about a love story from the 80s. And this is no exception. And something, Darth Plato, I have to say, we've seen a lot of men take on the role of playing Napoleon, this character who seems to be larger than life. Certainly is a historical figure that everyone knows about. What do you think about Armand Assante's role and approach in playing this historical figure?
I like his presence and his demeanor. He thought he does the role very well. He clearly researched it because there's a lot of minute there's a lot of minute details in some scenes that you don't really get as a casual viewer that someone that's more known to the history will catch. We can talk about that a little bit if you want, like his use of the
Sure. Go ahead and
hands,
tell
for
me what those
example.
things are, please.
And he doesn't quite look like Napoleon in the face. He would probably be a little bit more rounded in the face. As the actor's a little bit less than that. Josephine, however, is carried pretty which is I actually think is better well done than Napoleon himself. She'd probably be a little prettier than the actual person, the actress, I mean. And the psychology of the character, I think, is pretty well represented. I think they did a good job with Josephine.
Well, one of the things we know about Napoleon and Josephine is that they were painted frequently. There are records not only of their age, where they came from, and what they look like, but there are paintings and historical documents that describe their likenesses, everything from height to weight, everything about them. So this is a couple that not only do we know a lot about where they're from, but what they look like and, what happened to them over a certain period of time. So there certainly isn't, any kind of lacking of information on that regard. What I can say that I find very interesting is the pairing of the two of them. And, we do know historically, Darth Plato, that Napoleon was in his 20s when he met this beautiful woman, Josephine. He called her Josephine, who was in her 30s, an older woman. And she was married to someone. And the story starts off quite, scary. Darth Plato, they decide to go the guillotine route, which, often I have to cover my face and I say, oh no, that, something like this is going to happen. And you can see that we start off in what appears to be the French Revolution, a very sad time for many aristocrats in France who were essentially, captured and unfortunately executed during the revolution. What happened? How did Josephine end up a prisoner? And why wasn't Napoleon a prisoner here?
Well, he was a prisoner for about 10 days, but that was after the revolution fallen. To answer your question, Josephine was originally married to a man named Alexander Beauharnais, which is how she got the name Beauharnais. Her given name was Marie Joseph Rose Taché de la Pagerie. She came from a family from Martinique in the Caribbean. She wasn't born in France. Napoleon likewise was not born in France, so that's something that's an interesting detail about them. But they were both islanders. When she traveled to France, I think she was about 16 at the behest of her father as a part of an arranged marriage that was originally designed for her older sister, but her older sister got sick and died. So Marie went in her place. She didn't become known as Josephine until she met Napoleon. Before that, she was just called Marie or Rose. And she met Alexander. It wasn't a happy marriage. They had 2 children, Eugene and Hortense. They were 2 years apart. When the French Revolution broke out, he got involved, Alexander got involved, and he was arrested and sent to prison, and he was guillotined. Josephine was also arrested for having perceived ties. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but she was taken before tribunal and condemned and was thrown into a rather nasty crypt, converted into a prison. The reality is much worse than what you see in the TV show. The TV show is a very watered down version of what actually happened. She became very ill. Her children were not with her. I don't know where the children were at that time, but she definitely was not with her children. Her cellmate was an English poet. I don't recall her name, but what we know about that time really comes from this English writer. What going on at that time was called the Reign of Terror, which was instituted around October 31st or Halloween in 1794 and carried over until the following July, when what was called the Thermidoric coup, to overthrow Robespierre, however you want to pronounce it. And Josephine was scheduled to be guillotined 4 days later, so the overthrow of Robespierre likely saved her from that fate.
Yeah, you make a good point here. And the story, if any of you have had a chance to see it, this part 1 of Napoleon and Josephine, a love story, it's quite dire. Josephine is essentially a prisoner. And as you stated, Darth Vader, there are some inaccuracies, of course, but we do see that she is being kept prisoner and she's somewhat pleading for her children in this case, which we know isn't true, but it doesn't matter. It's still quite dramatic. We're seeing, unfortunately, people losing their lives to the guillotine. And, right when things pretty much seem very dour for her, it is quite a difficult position she's in. She's doing everything she can to kind of parlay her way out of this. We find that she's being informed that Robespierre has fallen out of favor and he's no longer going to be in charge. He's going to be investigated for crimes. And suddenly she is a free woman again.
Mhm.
Certainly it does seem like a miracle in a sense, Darth Plato,
It
talking
was.
about in the nick of time. And of course, I'm not going to say that that's exactly how it happened, but it certainly, let's say day wise and how many dates or so to speak in the hours, but it certainly did feel quite desperate at that moment where she was in a situation where she didn't know if she was going to live or die, Darth Plato.
That's true. It certainly was a more severe situation than what Napoleon was in. Napoleon was arrested and thrown into prison immediately after that. So there's a certain irony in that, and that Josephine was in prison, got out of prison, and Napoleon was arrested and put into prison. His time there only lasted about 10 days. Now, I'm not sure how long Josephine was in there, but it was more than 10 days. He was arrested because of his association with one of the Robespierre brothers, the younger brother of the infamous Maximilian, and he was on the short list of very good officers, which he was, and he had acquired the confidence of the younger Robespierre, and because of his association with that man, he was, guilt by association. He was rounded up and thrown in prison. He was in Genoa at the time, and somewhere between Genoa and Nice, so he wasn't actually in France at the time when that happened. He was not in Paris. If he had been in Paris, he might have been guillotined.
Well, that's a terrifying thought. And, they go ahead and kind of show us that he's a little snarky in the sense of while watching another aristocrat unfortunately fall victim to the guillotine, Napoleon, in his audacity says that you can't take her hair. It's sort of like property of the state or something like that. He doesn't want to see anybody, make money off of these deaths of aristocrats. And of course, after this poor lady has been executed, it's quite a dramatic situation. But they show him kind of intervening, and it almost gives you a sense that he was very present and around at that time, but at odds with what was going on, almost helpless to intervene in this case. Was he helpless to intervene during that time, Darth Plato, when Robespierre was in power?
Well, that's true. They did show that. I think they're showing him in a more flattering light than he probably deserves at that time. Napoleon at that time was pretty thoroughly Jacobin in his writing. He was basically a revolutionary through and through. How much that he really believed, I don't know, but he certainly gave lip service to it because it was just the thing to do in those days. He had his career to think about. He wanted to advance his career. That was very important to him. Supporting his family was very important to him, and he wasn't gonna bite the hand that feeds him. There's a scene early in the episode where he's offered the command of an army to go west into the revolution, the counter-revolutionary areas in the west of France to put that down, and he bluntly turns that down. The way that was depicted was not at all how it went down. Unfortunately, he was not he he was not this paragon of light in the time of revolution. He went along with a lot of what happened. There were a lot of things that he did not approve of because for tactical reasons, not necessarily because he thought it was wrong, like the execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He did not agree with because he thought that they was tactically unwise to do so, which would make sense. It would have made sense to keep the people alive so you can ransom them and use them as leverage, but the revolution didn't do that. So that scene is a bit not well done, unfortunately.
Well, it is something to think about. And of course, certainly the politics of that time just must have been, bewildering in the sense of how things could have gotten really, gone so poorly for both sides there. And of course, as you can imagine, Josephine, she and I actually, she's from Martinique. My father is from Martinique. I am an island girl, although I am American here, raised in America. My ancestry stems from a similar place. I'm not related to Josephine, but it is interesting to see the history about Josephine and how intrigued. This love story really is about, as you said, Darth Plato, not necessarily focusing too much on the politics or on the military strategy of the time, but on the way that Josephine and Napoleon met, and they gave us some backstory here where Josephine is in prison and now she's suddenly not in prison, and Napoleon's military career looks like it may be changing now because things have switched over from Robespierre, and now there's expectations that he's going to make. But what's interesting, Darth Plato, what's really interesting about this is the sense of manipulation that we get, at least in this depiction of these two individuals, where they know, when I say they, the rulers of France or whoever is in power at that moment, Darth Plato, knows how talented Napoleon is. They know he's fantastic on the battlefield, and they want to utilize that. And ironically, this love affair, this encounter after, the beautiful Josephine, she is no longer in prison. And after she gets sort of, released from prison, if you will, or however this happens, she does become a mistress. She is a widower, as you mentioned. Her husband was unfortunately killed, and she's a widower. She's with this gentleman, and while she's at his home and they're having a party or whatever it is, however they care to depict it here in this story, Napoleon gets a glimpse of her and he's instantly struck in, and he kind of like falls for her right away. This older woman who has children. Napoleon can't resist this woman. And I think it's really interesting, Darth Plato, because Armand Assante chooses to kind of, choose a somewhat more romantic way of showing this kind of passion that he has for her, where he's almost dumbstruck. But we know that Napoleon was a man of many words. So I can't help but wondering, Darth Plato, whether, what he was thinking. Would he actually be quiet when he sees her, or would he be trying to chat her up and make love to her right then and there? Darth Plato, what do you think about that fateful moment where they meet in the series? Do you think it was anything like what we saw, where he kind of befriends her children first? What are your thoughts, just in general, from what you know? What do you think might have happened at that moment?
Well, it certainly works for the TV show. I thought they translated it fairly well. It's obviously not exactly what happened in real life, but that's fine. They met in October of 1795. They married the following March, and we do see them getting married in this episode. So that's about, they knew each other for about 5 minutes, 5 months. I believe they met during a function hosted by Barras. You see Barras in the series is a recurring character. He was the head of the French government at the time. They're what was called the Directory. That's what it was called at the time. Napoleon himself was actually coming off another relationship. He had been involved with, they didn't show this in the series, but what really happened was that he was involved with Desiree Clary, a lady named Desiree Clary, that lasted for some time. He wanted to propose to her, but her family did not approve of the union. He met through his older brother, Joseph. Joseph was already married to Desiree's older sister. And that didn't work out, and that was very upsetting to Napoleon. Because she stopped writing letters to him, and he got distressed by that, and he interpreted that as it was the end of their relationship, which it was. And he met Josephine right after that, so she was, I guess you could say, she was almost the rebound girl. And he dealt with it a bit more smoothly than what you see in that scene in the series. The setting in the episode was he's in the what you call the topographical office, which is actually where French strategy was formulated. They called it the topographical office to sort of mislead spies. And when he goes in there, you can see she made comment that his hands were shaking. And that doesn't necessarily mean that he was nervous, but he did have a medical condition at that time, incurred from an incident on the battlefield where he had a incessant itching on his hand. So that could have been a reference what that is, but you don't really know that in a series.
Yeah, I did notice that they touched on that just a bit, Darth Plato, and it was not quite. I don't believe that it was necessarily that important for the sake of the story, because we certainly weren't necessarily so concerned about the health of either individual at that point, but they wanted you to see very specific characteristics about the character. But, for the most part, I don't believe that any of this was the basis of the love story. It was just something about, the character Napoleon, about the historical figure, that I'm not even quite sure what to make of it. I don't even know whether it was necessary. However, perhaps they felt that they had to go ahead and show some elements of Napoleon, or else they would be, severely, chastised for this. And to be honest with you, Darth Plato, this story, at least this television movie, gives us the impression that, Josephine did not care to be married at that time. Excuse me. She didn't care to be married at that time. And so, although she likes or appears to be quite fond of Napoleon, who is going somewhere, I mean, he's certainly a public figure, a well-known public figure. Everyone knows about this man. She's not that enticed by the notion of being a wife again, and even makes sort of a snarky remark, at least I call it a snarky remark, of saying that I'd rather be some man's mistress. Darth Plato, can you explain to us, why she might be having feelings like that? Why Napoleon's offer wasn't necessarily anything that could entice her, at least in the television series?
I'm not really sure why they depicted it like that. It does seem like she wanted to have a stable environment, especially at that time. She just got out of prison and almost died. She has 2 children to take care of. She wanted security, and he had a reputation for being a very competent officer. He had just there was the incident called the Whiff of Grapeshot incident, where he put down this uprising in Paris that may have saved the government. So he was at that point, he became a fast track officer from that point on. He was definitely the name that everyone was talking about at that time. So it made perfect sense that she would be into him. The question was, I think the better question is how she was going to get him into her. I think would have been a better question, but they chose to depict it in this way. It is a bit odd how they did that, but I got they just wanted to do it that way for the TV series. But I think that they made her out being hesitant to marry him wasn't entirely true. She was 6 years older than him and had kids. In those days, that was not an appealing match for a young man looking to marry for the first time. And you see that with his family in real life. His family loathed Josephine. They absolutely loathed Josephine, and interpreting her as just like she's just a hussy, gold digger, type of person. And that may not have been true. I think she was, and they show this in the series. They show that she's having like these flashbacks and this traumatic memory of the revolution. And I keep hitting my cord.
It's okay. It's okay. It's live TV. All right. It's okay.
But,
keep going.
No, they show that very well. She did possibly, not really sure for sure, but she might have had some sort of PTSD going on. And they hinted that in the series, and I think that's very well done that they did that.
Yeah, and you can't help but wonder. I personally, thank God that we are not aristocrats finding ourselves in the French Revolution at that time. But I personally, after going through something like that, could not stay in France. Just between you and I, that event. Yeah, I certainly would not be able to. I would have to leave. Maybe go back to Martinique. It certainly is beautiful there, guys. Certainly something to think about. But also the other consideration is her children. And, I think she almost gets guilted into having to find a stable situation for her children. Mm-hmm. And honestly, Napoleon he looks like a great match, Darth Plato. Like there is absolutely nothing wrong with kind of matching with this man who, while he may be a little rough on the edges, or at least they imply that he may not have had an aristocratic upbringing, and that he was not perhaps even from, the upper, I guess, class at the time, it doesn't seem to matter because it seems like all eyes are on him. Darth Plato, were all eyes on Napoleon at that time?
Yes, they were, because of that. And not at the beginning of the episode. At the beginning of the episode, he's just an officer in the army like any other. He doesn't really become that well known until that incident in Paris with the whip of grape shot. That's where he really becomes a household name. And then it just and his career after that is completely stratospheric after that, and well, the rest is history. But before that, he was really kind of an obscure guy. Prior to that, he never would have attracted the attention of someone like Josephine. Josephine was what you might call a player. She definitely knew how that game was, and she definitely, I think she was really the dominant force in that when they first met. Obviously, that changed in the long run, but I definitely think she got the advantage there. When she immediately after going out of prison, she did stay at the residence of Barras. That's true. There may have been something going on there that lasted a month. That some historians disagree as to just how involved they were with each other. She did on some occasions do this weird naked thing with Therese Tallien. They show Tallien in the series very briefly, and whether that's actually true or not, I don't know. But it probably is true, and he probably did it because he's the most powerful man in France, and she wanted, and like I said, she's trying to survive. And obviously, he wasn't marriage material. She wasn't going to marry him. But Napoleon would have been a more appealing, maybe a more appealing match, maybe. Even though Barras was the head of the government. So from that point of view, it looks like she's kind of stepping down. I mean, she's going from the head of state to just some guy on the officer corps. From that point of view, maybe she isn't really going up, but. Realistically, I think she probably would, because Barras just wasn't that kind of man. You see Barras in the series, he's kind of this weaselly guy, and Napoleon doesn't like him very much, and they were more friendly with each other in real life than they were shown in this series. They made him a bit more conniving than he probably was in this. I don't know why they did that for the series, but it was what it was.
Well, it's something to think about, certainly in this story. And, as we said before, there's going to be some kind of intrigue going back and forth, and knowing the type of letters. Now, this is the other very interesting part about the story, Darth Plato, is that Napoleon was known. Their love affair was well documented in various ways, but one of the most wonderful ways that the love story has been documented are in these letters that Napoleon wrote to Josephine, that they do talk about in the story. He's writing her these love letters, and they're not kind of ordinary, correspondence letters. They're not. They're passionate, letters. He's essentially making love to her, or at least telling her some of the things he's going to do to her when he sees her next. It's very passionate. It's very explicit. Certainly beautifully written love letters that is absolutely remarkable. Yes, and Tom Jr. Jackson, that's why we're talking about this historical fact, Darth Plato, that we still have, although I personally have never read a full letter, but we still have access to these amazing love letters.
Yeah, you can read them online.
Yes, that Napoleon has written to Josephine. And honestly, now I'm not going to say it's a situation of historical fact that everything in the letter. What I am saying is the notion of the passion that he had for Josephine.
Extremely infatuated.
Yes, I think that if they kind of skim on it a little bit. Darth Plato in the story. In Art Deco 78 says he worked with Armand years ago, a gentleman, great to watch on the set, excellent performer, and saw this in French years ago in Monaco. You lucky person, Art Deco 78, even going to Monaco. God bless you for having that experience. But yes, that must have been quite an experience seeing it there. And thank you for sharing that with us. But Darth Plato, we're talking about a time period where some of the things that might have even been said in these letters might not even have been spoken out loud. Darth Plato, what do you make of this? Napoleon, is he audacious?
Oh yeah, for sure. L'audace, toujours l'audace. That's absolutely the kind of man he was. That's for sure. He wrote all sorts of bizarre stuff in his letters, and the fact that she was stressing about it and showing it to some of her friends is very believable. It's like look what this guy's saying to me, and she definitely did not love him. She definitely saw him as a support structure, but he was obviously very infatuated with her. It was not even. I know it's called a love story, so it's a bit of a letdown to say she didn't love him, unfortunately. But it's true. She didn't love him. He definitely loved her. That is for sure. And he said all sorts of weird things I will see you in 3 days. Don't wash between now and then. I want to smell all of you. It was like I don't even know what the heck he's talking about. He says I look forward to your zigzags. I have no idea what that even means.
Well, you know something, Darth Plato.
He did say stuff like that in public. I'm sorry. On one
No, go ahead.
occasion,
Keep going.
he was socially awkward. One time, he was at a function and he was introduced. He was introduced to somebody, and he would say socially awkward things like, "Well, you have children. Do you breastfeed them yourself?" He would say stuff like that. It was just kind of weird. And Josephine was sort of was much more socially conscious about what to say and what not to say. She was a player in that world, and so she was definitely someone that would step in and speak for him on that level, on the social level, so that he didn't have to because he wasn't good at that kind of talk. He wasn't good at that kind of small talk, and so they
Well,
were definitely yeah they were definitely a power couple in that respect.
what's interesting about this is that, if you had asked me if we were talking about this in the 1980s, we certainly wouldn't even be, entertaining the idea that private letters between, let's say royal couples or celebrities would have been exposed or leaked. We would have never seen anything like that. But since this series has come out, Darth Plato, there have been many instances of private phone conversations, letters, even video of individuals, let's say, perhaps not as famous or as historically significant as Napoleon and Josephine, but certainly historical figures in our own time whose private affairs have made, the news and have been shared, against their will with the public. And it was equally shocking and surprising, Darth Plato, to hear some of those private moments. But you know something, Darth Plato? I have a feeling, and I could be wrong on this. I think Napoleon did not care if everyone saw those letters that he was writing to Josephine. In fact, I think he wanted everyone to know how he felt about this woman. I think that his passion in this was not just being able to marry this woman, but to declare it so that everyone knew. And that's what made this love story so incredibly powerful and profound, that he wanted the world to know that he loved this woman and was going to write down every moment of passion that he had for her that he could put on paper. What do you think, Darth Plato?
There's some truth to that. Um, the correspondence that was leaked didn't occur until some years later in 1798 when he was in Egypt. But by that time, he was talking of divorce. So that's really when his correspondence became public, and that was where it really became scandalous. But that's another episode. At this point in time, his correspondence was not public. Uh, yeah, I wouldn't. You're right though. He definitely was so infatuated that I definitely could see how he would want the world to know, shout it from the rooftops. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that were the case. His family did not approve. That's for sure. That was another thing that they showed in the series that I thought was well done. His mother loathed Josephine and didn't want him to have anything to do with her. And she was very Catholic, and she hated the French Revolution. She did not want to live in France. By that time, his family was living in the south of France. They were not in Corsica any longer. So they showed that in the series. In the series, they sort of implied that they were still living in Corsica. They were not living in Corsica at that time. They had since been driven off the island. There were complicated politics involved, and I'm not going to get into that here. Joseph was already living in France, so the fact that his mother would send Joseph as sort of this agent to spy on Napoleon. That's not how it went down. It didn't go down like that, but it's amusing that they showed it like that in the series. But it does belie, it confirms rather that the the attitude that many members of the family did have toward Josephine. Joseph kind of accepted it and supported them. I think some of his other brothers too, but his mother and sister did not like him. Did not like Josephine.
Well, aside from not getting approval from, the in-laws, so to speak, or the soon-to-be in-laws, which is not unusual for this time period, for this to happen of unapproved matches. And we do know that Retro Nerd Girl says so romantic. Absolutely, we know
Very
Napoleon
cool.
was a person who thought for himself. He, especially when it came to affairs of the heart here. I don't think wild horses could have pulled him away from Napoleon. However, from Josephine. However, we do know that, actions on the battlefield pulled him away from her. How often were they apart, more or less, Darth Plato?
At that point in time, they almost right away they showed they showed it in the episode where they got married, and he was late for his own marriage. The reason why he was late for his marriage is because he had a meeting at the government building with Barras, who had just offered him command of the entire army in Italy. Now, understand for a second where he was before. But before this, before meeting Josephine, he was at a point in his life where he was trying to get into. He was an army. He was an officer without a post. He was not posted, and so he was trying to be reassigned back into the army of Italy, where he thought that was the best prospect for his career. He wanted to go back to the artillery, to the staff on the artillery at the army of Italy. He did not want to go to the west of France, where he thought that would not be a good place for his career. He didn't want to fight Frenchmen. That's why he turned it down. They showed that in the scene. Some of the stuff they show in the episode is shown out of order. It didn't happen in that order. So that's why he was late for the wedding, because he had just gotten this a plum assignment. He was a fast track officer at that point, and that definitely was a plum assignment. He was offered a command where some of the officers on staff were more than 10 years older than he was. It shocked a lot of people because he was so young to be given a command like that. So he was late. That's why he was late. And they got married. They had a very short honeymoon, very like 48 hours, I think. And then he was off to join the army. So they were separated almost immediately after they got married. And he was down in Italy for several months. They didn't see each other for a long time.
Yes, and that is something to be aware of and not unusual for the time, Darth Plato. However, we do see something that the story, or at least the production team wanted us to get a sense of, was not only did Josephine kind of fear the notion of having to be married again, at least from this particular story, but also the notion that she felt like she was being manipulated. And we also get a sense that Napoleon was being manipulated as well in this scenario. Were they being somewhat manipulated?
She was somewhat manipulating him, yeah, because she, like I said, she wanted a safe place to live. Um, as far as whether she was being manipulated, I think that would probably be a bit overstated in the series. They made it more dramatic than it probably was, but it was what it was. I thought they did a good job with it all together, but it wasn't entirely historical. I don't think it was quite. It didn't. I don't think it quite went down like
Okay. Well, it is something to think about, and something that, I think you can't necessarily escape the notion of, as you said, that perhaps he had somewhat more intentions towards her, of being with her and being in love with her, than she did. But she did have a lot going on, Darth Plato, in the sense of trying to figure out where she was going to be. As you said, she didn't care to stay in France. And I don't blame her for not wanting to live there, because I wouldn't step another foot in that place. As I said, if I were an aristocrat alive during that time, you couldn't get me back in that country,
that.
knowing what had happened just a few years earlier. So that would be a constant fear of mine, knowing that ever even happened, and how close she became to kind of being a victim of that, terrible situation.
Like how
But
I did.
Yes. And, uh, the last thing that I was kind of wondering about was the notion, and of course, the next show that we do, Darth Plato, which will be next Friday at the same time. If you're available, are you available? You're available next Friday at 10.
Yes, by all
Okay,
means.
so we'll be doing part two, the second part of Napoleon and Josephine next Friday at 10. The next thing that I kind of want to talk about is the notion of, since they were apart for periods of time, maybe longer than is comfortable, the idea of this notion of taking on romantic lovers, so to speak, um, not necessarily anybody that you think you're going to be with forever, but this idea of her doing something like that, I think it's very interesting. But was that a common practice at the time, Darth Plato?
Not really. The idea of a man like that, or marrying an older, or someone who's an older woman like that for kids, that was kind of that was a bit weird. So he wasn't an ordinary man. He was a very unusual man, very complicated man, very brilliant man. He's one of the most interesting characters I've ever read about, and I've read a lot.
Well, what did you think of this part one, production of their love story in particular, Darth Plato? Do you think that part one did justice for how that first encounter, which is what I think that this first part really focuses on, for me at least, was this first encounter between the two, where he just couldn't get Josephine out of his mind. She was there forever. What did you think of this part one production of the story?
I thought they did both of their characters pretty well. They built up a little bit too much about the cajoling on the side about her friendship with Madame Tayenne. I don't think they were really that close to each other really. She was a much more notorious than Josephine. She had a reputation. She was nicknamed State Property, which gives you some idea as to how been around she was. Josephine was kind of from that world, so she had a reputation for. She had several lovers by that time. She was very well known in France for that, in the series towards the end of the episode, you see her approached by Hippolyte Charles, the this younger this younger guy with the smooth blue uniform. He's a what you call a hussar, a Hungar. He's a not Hungarian. Is a cavalryman, a light cavalryman. That's a very big deal in this story. That was all done really well. The way she was done was really well. Napoleon, the way he was gushing about her to his brothers, like, "Oh, I'm getting married. I'm gonna be a father." He could not stop talking about her, and I thought they did that really well. And his family hated Josephine. I thought they did pretty well.
Was is it this gentleman? Was this in part one? I can't remember just now, Darth Leto.
Yeah, Hippolyte Charles. Yeah,
Okay.
that was the first extramarital affair between them. And she started it. She did.
Yeah, and it's I almost don't even know what to make of it. It seems like there's a lot of passion going on in this story, Darth Leto, and it always seems like there's some opportunity right around the corner. And I'm also wondering, and of course, Napoleon is one of the most intriguing characters in history, and a lot has been written about him. But I'm almost wondering, in regards to Josephine, with her appeal as well, the two of them together might have been something, quite interesting to see, knowing what they were capable of, just even from a social point of view. As you said, when they got together, she was able to kind of help him with his deficiencies, and perhaps he was able to do that for
Yeah.
her as well. But it almost indicates as if, she might have brought out in social situations the best in Napoleon. Although this is kind of a reach, but the notion of these love affairs, so to speak, having lovers on the side, it certainly does put a different twist to all of this.
Yeah, but
And
not him at first. He was not having extramarital affairs at that time. Not until later. That did not happen until after. his he had this very exalted view. He had the sense of Josephine as mine that was very exalted. That was very up here, like almost like he was venerating Josephine. And when he found out that she was involved with this man, that really did shatter their love. And we'll see that when we get into the other episodes. But he
Yeah,
was not he was not fooling around at that time.
right. And Tom Jr. Jackson talks about if Napoleon would think many years from then, people would talk about him or relationships. Well, he did have some incredible battles on the field, Tom Jr. Jackson, that are studied in military schools and by soldiers all over and historians as well. So no one is ever going to stop talking about Napoleon.
No.
But in regards to his relationships, certainly he is proving someone who certainly makes an impression when it comes to a relationship, one that is for the history books. And I'm so
Yes.
glad that I got a chance to watch this part one. Darth Plato, you and I are going to watch part two, and then talk about it next Friday at 10 a.m. Certainly to continue the series. Any final thoughts on part one of Josephine, Napoleon and Josephine, a love story?
The only other thing that I'm going to mention is look for the relationship between Napoleon and Eugene, which was Josephine's son from a previous marriage. He loved Eugene, and Eugene loved him like a father. Where after Napoleon went into exile at Saint Helena, he was the only family member that visited him on the island. He he never he had a lot of children. Napoleon, he did. He had maybe 9 children that we know of from. He had from at least 9 children from 9 different women that we know of, and not just from what we know of. Probably more than maybe as many as 22. But no one was more his son than from Eugene, and that is a relationship that they kind of touch on in this episode. He likes him a lot. Eugene likes him a lot, and that may have gone a long way with getting Josephine to marry him, and that his friend he wasn't just being nice to her son because he wanted to be with her. He did love Eugene like a son.
Yes, and Retro Nerd Girl says this story is so fascinating. It is fascinating, and it certainly has a lot of twists and turns that would make modern day relationships somewhat comparable. It certainly was a complicated situation for both Napoleon and Josephine, and perhaps certainly is the reason why it's so intriguing. And of course, there's much more to talk about when Darth Plato and I do our review of part two. Darth Plato, where can people find you?
I'm right here. You want me? Here I am.
So anybody who wants to reach out to Darth Plato should certainly reach out to Positive Fandom to get in contact with Darth Plato and continue the conversation. Guys, you can always reach me. I'm here on Positive Fandom, my YouTube channel. If you like what you're seeing, please do like and subscribe to Positive Fandom. You can also catch me on the Burr Network, as well as Lorraine Creole's channel and the 1/6 Scale Man Network.
The
I think
issue.
Yes, yes. I think this Friday or Saturday, I should be on the Burr Network for Midnight Musings. So do look on the community pages for that on the Burr Network. And of course, here on my community page, I will probably announce it as well. But also on Sunday, I'll be doing my Sunday brunch show at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But also at night, on Sunday night, I'm going to be doing my live watch party of The Last of Us, episode 2. So please do check that out. And Darth Plato, thank you so much for joining me again
That's
for
having me.
another amazing historical review. I'm enjoying these so much, and I look forward to the next one. And for everybody out there, check out Napoleon and Josephine, the Love Story, Part 1 with Armand Asante and Jacqueline Bisset. There is a Napoleon production coming up this year. So we are going to be talking a lot about Napoleon going forward up into thank you so much, Retro Nerd Girls. So appreciate it.
You're
And
welcome.
everybody, yes, thank you, Tom Jr. Jackson. We are all goof people. And for everybody out there, no matter where you are in the galaxy, always do remember to please be kind. Take care, everybody. Bye.